was a cold October night when Tom Harper, a long-haul trucker, loaded his semi at the depot just outside of Kansas City. The route was familiar, 800 miles straight south to Texas. He'd driven it dozens of times, but tonight was different. Tom had a strange feeling as he signed off on his papers, a twinge of unease in the pit of his stomach. "Be careful on this trip," Jim, the lot attendant, muttered as Tom climbed into his rig. Tom frowned. "Why's that?" Jim just shook his head. "Some folks say weird things happen when you're out on Route 666. I hear there's been sightings." Tom let out a dry laugh. "Route 666, you've been watching too many scary movies, Jim." But as he shifted gears and pulled onto the open highway, Jim's words lingered in his mind. The night stretched on, quiet except for the hum of his diesel engine. Tom glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 11:30 p.m. He was making good time. He turned up the radio to shake the feeling of loneliness and took a sip of his now lukewarm coffee. Out of nowhere, the CB radio crackled to life. "Breaker, breaker. Anyone else on Route 666 tonight? Over." Tom hesitated, but then replied, "This is Big Red. I'm rolling southbound on 666. Who's out there? Over." For a moment, there was silence. Then the voice came back, low, gravelly, almost like a growl. "Turn back, driver. Ain't nothing down this road but bad things. Over." Tom frowned and grabbed the mic. "Who is this? Quit playing games, buddy. Over." No reply. The radio went dead. Tom didn't like the strange voice, but he chalked it up to some bored trucker messing around. Pranks like that were common on the road. He kept driving. The highway ahead was empty, no headlights, no taillights, just darkness. Up ahead on the shoulder of the road, a car sat with its hazard lights flashing. Tom slowed his rig. He knew stopping on a dark road could be dangerous, but he couldn't just leave someone stranded. As he pulled over, he noticed how quiet it was. No wind, no crickets, just silence. Tom grabbed his flashlight, climbed down, and approached the car. "Hello? Anyone in there?" The driver's window was down, but no one answered. When Tom shined his flashlight into the car, his stomach dropped. The car was empty. No bags, no signs of passengers, nothing. It looked abandoned, but the engine was still running. Suddenly, Tom felt a chill run down his spine. Something was watching him. He turned slowly and shone his flashlight behind him. For a split second, he thought he saw someone, a figure, dark and tall, standing on the edge of the road, just beyond the beam of his light. Then it was gone. Tom's heart pounded as he rushed back to his truck. He didn't know what he saw, but he wasn't about to stick around to find out. Tom slammed the door shut, locked it, and threw the truck into gear. As he picked up speed, he kept glancing into his mirrors. The car disappeared into the darkness behind him, but that feeling of being watched didn't go away. And then he saw it. The figure was in the road. Tom barely had time to react. He swerved hard, tires screeching as the massive truck skidded across the asphalt. He held the wheel tight, the sound of grinding metal filling his ears. Finally, the truck came to a stop. Tom's chest heaved as he looked ahead into the darkness. The road was empty. No figure, no nothing. "Jesus," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. The CB radio crackled again. "You should have turned back, Big Red. Now it's too late. Over." Tom grabbed the mic. "Listen, whoever you are, this ain't funny." The voice didn't respond. Instead, the CB filled with static, loud, deafening static. Tom turned it off. For the next few hours, Tom forced himself to focus on the road. He kept the headlights bright, scanning for anything unusual. Every so often, he thought he saw shapes in the fog rolling across the pavement, shadows that weren't quite human, twisting and writhing like they were alive. At one point, he caught something in his peripheral vision, a shape crouched on the passenger seat. Tom jerked his head to look, but there was nothing there. "You're losing it, Tom," he said to himself, though his voice trembled. But he wasn't imagining the smell. It hit him like a punch to the gut, a horrible stench, like rotten meat and burning hair. It filled the cab, choking him. Tom gagged and rolled the window down. As the cool air rushed in, he looked into the side mirror. Something was climbing onto the back of his trailer. Tom slammed the brakes, and the truck shuddered to a stop. He grabbed his flashlight and climbed out again, his hands shaking. He shone the light along the side of the trailer, moving carefully. "If this is some kind of sick joke, it's not funny," he called. The only answer was the creaking of the truck and the whisper of the wind. He circled around to the back of the trailer, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. And then he saw it. Claw marks. Deep gouges, like something with massive hands had scraped down the metal. Tom's mouth went dry. He backed away toward the cab of his truck, but as he turned, his flashlight flickered and died. In the pitch black, he heard it, breathing. Slow, ragged breathing, coming from right behind him. Tom ran. He stumbled up into the cab, slammed the door, and locked it. He didn't dare look behind him as he started the truck and floored the gas. The miles passed slowly, each second stretching into an eternity. The road ahead seemed endless, as if the highway itself didn't want him to leave. He checked the clock again, 3:15 a.m. But that couldn't be right. Hours had passed, hadn't they? Something thumped against the roof of his cab. Thud. Thud. Tom gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. "It's just your imagination," he whispered. Thud. He glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. A face was pressed against the glass. Its skin was pale and stretched too tight, its eyes black and hollow. The mouth was wide, full of sharp, jagged teeth, and it was grinning. Tom screamed and swerved the truck. The creature disappeared, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. By dawn, the highway was empty and silent. Tom's headlights dimmed as the first light of morning began to creep across the sky. The road sign up ahead read, Route 666 exit 2 miles. Relief washed over him. Just a couple more miles and he'd be off this cursed road. But as he neared the exit, he saw something lying across the asphalt. It was man. Tom hit the brakes, heart racing. He squinted through the windshield. The man didn't move. Tom honked the horn. "Get out of the road!" The figure sat up slowly, its head turning toward him. Tom's blood ran cold. It was the same face he'd seen in the mirror, pale, grinning, eyes black as night. The creature stood, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. It started walking toward the truck. Tom didn't wait. He floored the gas pedal. The engine roared as the truck barreled down the road, but the figure didn't stop. It was running now, keeping pace with the truck, that horrible grin never leaving its face. Tom screamed as he sped toward the exit, and then everything went black. When Tom woke up, he was lying on the side of the road. His truck was parked a few feet away, engine silent. The sun was high in the sky now, and everything looked normal. No fog, no creatures, no claw marks. Tom sat up slowly, his whole body aching. He staggered to his truck and climbed inside. The cab smelled like old coffee and sweat, no trace of the stench from the night before. His CB radio crackled. "Big Red, you out there? Over." It was Jim, the lot attendant. Tom grabbed the mic, his voice hoarse. "Jim, yeah, I'm here. What's going on? You okay, Tom? You never checked in last night. Thought we lost you for a bit. Over." Tom stared at the mic, his hands trembling. "Yeah," he whispered. "I'm fine." But as he looked into the rearview mirror, his heart stopped. There, in the reflection, something grinned back at him. Tom was a long-haul trucker. He had been driving trucks for nearly 20 years. He liked the open road, the hum of the engine, and the time alone. But he also knew the highway could be a strange place. Sometimes it felt alive, like it had secrets. But Tom didn't believe in ghosts, or at least he didn't before that night. It all happened one dark, foggy night on Route 89, a stretch of road in the middle of nowhere. It was the kind of place where you could drive for hours without seeing another car. It was also where Tom picked up a hitchhiker who should never have been there. Tom had been driving for hours, his eyes tired, the radio playing low country music. He didn't have another stop planned until sunrise, so he was surprised when he saw someone standing on the side of the road. The man was in the beam of his headlights, waving his hand for a ride. Tom frowned. It wasn't normal to see someone on this road so late at night. Where the hell did he come from? Tom muttered. As the truck got closer, he could see the hitchhiker better. The man was wearing an old torn coat, and his hat was pulled low over his face. Something about him didn't feel right, but Tom shook his head. He's just a guy down on his luck, Tom said to himself. He didn't like leaving people stranded. Besides, the road was long, and maybe it'd be nice to have some company. He pulled the truck to the side of the road with a hiss of brakes and leaned out the window. "Where you headed, partner?" Tom asked. The hitchhiker didn't answer right away. He stepped out of the fog and smiled, a small, strange smile. "Anywhere down the road will do," the man said. His voice was low, almost too soft for Tom to hear. "Hop in," Tom said, opening the passenger door. The man climbed into the cab, moving slow, like it was hard for him. Tom noticed that his clothes were wet, like he'd been walking in the rain, but there hadn't been any rain for days. The man sat quietly, staring out the window as Tom pulled back onto the road. For a while, the cab was quiet except for the sound of the engine. Tom tried to make small talk. "So, what are you doing out here this time of night?" he asked. The hitchhiker didn't look at him. "Just traveling," he said. His voice was flat and cold. Tom frowned. He glanced at the man. His face looked pale in the dim light, and he didn't seem to blink much. Tom noticed that the hitchhiker's hands, resting on his knees, were dirty and covered in mud. "Where'd you come from?" Tom tried again, his voice more nervous this time. The hitchhiker turned to look at him then. His eyes were dark, and they seemed too big for his face. Tom swallowed hard. "From a place you don't want to know about," the man said. He smiled again, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Tom felt the hair on his arms stand up. He turned the radio louder to break the silence, but the hitchhiker reached over and turned it off. "I like it quiet," he said softly. Tom didn't argue. His hands gripped the wheel tighter, and the road stretched on in front of him, endless and empty. Tom kept driving, but things started to feel strange. The fog outside was getting thicker, so thick that Tom could barely see a few feet in front of the truck. He slowed down. "I've never seen fog this bad," he said, trying to sound normal. The hitchhiker didn't answer. Tom glanced at the rearview mirror. For a split second, he thought he saw someone sitting in the back of the truck cab, just a dark shadow in the corner of his eye. He turned his head quickly to look, but there was nothing there, just empty space. His heart started to beat faster. He shook his head. "Get a grip, Tom. You're just tired." But then, out of nowhere, the hitchhiker started to hum a strange tune. It was a slow, haunting sound, and it sent chills down Tom's spine. "You okay there, buddy?" Tom asked, his voice shaky. The hitchhiker stopped humming and looked at Tom again. "Do you know what happens to men who drive these roads too long?" he asked. Tom frowned. "What are you talking about?" The hitchhiker's smile widened. "Sometimes the road swallows them up. Sometimes they don't come back." Tom felt his stomach twist. He didn't like this guy. "Maybe it's time you get out," Tom said, his voice firm. But the hitchhiker shook his head. "It's too late for that, Tom." Tom blinked. "How do you know my name?" The hitchhiker didn't answer. Suddenly, the truck's engine started to sputter. Tom cursed under his breath and glanced at the fuel gauge. It showed a full tank, but the truck was slowing down. "What the hell?" Tom muttered, flipping switches and checking the dashboard. The truck rolled to a stop, the headlights barely cutting through the fog. Tom sat in the silence, his hands sweating. "This can't be happening," he said. He turned to look at the hitchhiker, but the man was gone. The passenger seat was empty. Tom's heart stopped. He looked around the cab, his breath coming in quick gasps. "Where'd you go?" he whispered. A sound came from outside, a soft scraping noise, like footsteps on gravel. Tom looked out the window, but the fog was too thick to see anything. Then he heard the voice. "Tom." It was the hitchhiker's voice, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding the truck. "Tom, let me in." Tom locked the doors. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the key. Suddenly, something hit the windshield hard. Tom jumped and screamed. A face appeared in the glass, pale and twisted. It was the hitchhiker. His mouth opened wide in an impossible grin, and he slammed his hands against the windshield. "Let me in, Tom." Tom scrambled out of his seat and grabbed the small tire iron he kept under the dashboard. He couldn't think. He just knew he had to get away. Tom shoved the driver's door open and ran into the fog. He couldn't see anything, but he didn't care. He could still hear the hitchhiker's voice behind him. "Tom, you can't run from me." Tom kept running. His boots crunched on the gravel, and his breath came in ragged gasps. The fog seemed alive, wrapping around him like cold fingers. Finally, he stumbled and fell to his knees. He looked back, but the truck was gone. The road was gone. He was kneeling in the middle of a field that hadn't been there before. The fog was thinner here, but it was still deathly quiet. "Where am I?" Tom whispered. A shadow moved in front of him. Tom looked up, and there stood the hitchhiker, but he wasn't human anymore. His face was stretched and hollow, his eyes black as night. His mouth opened wide, and he pointed a long, bony finger at Tom. "I told you, Tom," the hitchhiker said, his voice echoing. "You've been on the road too long. Now it's time for you to stay here, forever." Tom tried to scream, but the fog closed in again, covering everything. The next morning, a state trooper driving down Route 89 found Tom's truck sitting on the side of the road, its engine dead and the doors wide open. The fog had cleared, and the sun was rising, but Tom was nowhere to be found. The trooper searched the truck and found something strange on the passenger seat, an old wet hat and a few muddy footprints leading to nowhere. They never found Tom, and the locals say his truck still appears on Route 89 sometimes, parked on the side of the road. Some say you can still hear Tom's voice in the fog, calling for help. But no one stops. Tommy Granger had been a long-haul trucker for over 15 years. He'd seen every kind of road, from highways slicing through endless deserts to twisting mountain passes covered in ice. Nothing ever scared Tommy. He'd always tell folks, "A man who drives all night sees ghosts everywhere, but ghosts can't touch you, not unless you let them." But one night, Tommy saw something he couldn't explain, and it still haunts him to this day. It was late October, and Tommy was hauling a trailer full of furniture from Kansas to Oregon. He was already behind schedule. A bad storm had slowed him down earlier, and the company boss was breathing down his neck. That night, he drove through Nebraska's flat plains, with nothing but dark skies and endless fields stretching for miles. It was well past midnight, and the only sound was the hum of the engine and the faint rattle of his cargo. Tommy lit a cigarette and rubbed his tired eyes. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going without a stop. The next truck stop was at least 50 miles ahead. That's when he saw it. A sign appeared by the side of the road, reflecting his headlights. "Last stop motel and diner, 2 miles ahead. Best coffee around." Tommy frowned. He knew this route like the back of his hand. There were no motels or diners along this stretch of highway. He grabbed his CB radio just to see if anyone else had noticed. "Breaker 19, this is Roadrunner. Anyone else picking up that last stop sign on 63 westbound?" Tommy's voice cracked through the empty line. Static answered him. He turned off the radio and muttered, "Must have been put up recently. Maybe it's one of those new rest stops." He figured a quick stop for coffee couldn't hurt. Anything to shake the creeping tiredness. 2 miles later, the motel appeared like it had been plucked out of another time. Its neon sign flickered against the pitch-black sky. "Last stop motel, vacancies. Diner open 24 hours. The place looked old. Not run down, but old. Like it had been built decades ago and frozen in time. The parking lot was empty except for one rusted pickup truck parked in the corner. A faint yellow glow spilled from the diner's windows, but there were no cars on the road. No lights in the motel rooms. Tommy felt a little uneasy, but coffee was coffee. He pulled his rig into the lot, parking far enough away that his truck wouldn't block anything. He shut off the engine, climbed down, and stretched his aching back. The place was silent. Not even a cricket chirped in the fields. Tommy grabbed his wallet and keys and walked toward the diner. The screen door creaked as he stepped inside, and a bell above the door chimed softly. The diner looked like something from an old movie. Red booths lined the walls, the tables shined with spotless chrome, and a jukebox sat humming quietly in the corner. There was no one inside except for a single waitress standing behind the counter. She smiled at him. Her uniform was a pale blue dress with a white apron. Her hair was curled, and she wore bright red lipstick, like she had stepped right out of the 1950s. "Evening, sugar," she said cheerfully. "Take a seat. Coffee's hot." Tommy nodded and sat at the counter, his back to the door. "Just a coffee. Black," the waitress said. Her name tag read Dottie. Tommy watched as she poured steaming coffee into a ceramic mug and set it down in front of him. He wrapped his hands around it, grateful for the warmth. "Long haul tonight?" Dottie asked, wiping the counter with a cloth. "Yeah," Tommy replied. "Heading west. Wasn't expecting to see a diner out here." "Don't remember this place." Dottie chuckled softly. "We're always here, honey. Folks just pass on by sometimes without seeing us." Her words made the hairs on Tommy's neck stand up. He shrugged it off and sipped his coffee. It tasted strong and bitter, exactly what he needed. As he drank, Tommy realized something strange. The jukebox was playing, but he hadn't seen Dottie start it. The song was an old, slow tune, one he didn't recognize. The melody felt wrong, like it was out of tune. Tommy tried to ignore it. He focused on his coffee and the quiet sound of Dottie humming along. That's when the door opened. The bell above the door chimed, and Tommy turned to see who had come in. A man stood in the doorway. He wore a brown suit, dirty and wrinkled, like he'd been wearing it for weeks. His face was pale, his eyes sunken. He looked at Tommy and smiled, showing yellow teeth. "Evening, friend," the man said. His voice was slow and cold. "Mind if I join you?" Tommy swallowed hard. Something about this man felt off. Sure man, take a seat." The man didn't sit at the counter. Instead, he walked past Tommy and slid into a booth behind him. Tommy could feel the man's eyes on the back of his head. "Coffee for the gentleman?" Dottie asked cheerfully, but her voice sounded different now, flat, empty, like someone reading lines from a script. The man in the suit didn't answer. Tommy turned slightly, just enough to see him out of the corner of his eye. The man sat perfectly still, staring at Tommy with those hollow eyes. The jukebox kept playing its strange, slow song. Tommy's pulse quickened. He'd seen his share of weirdos on the road, but this was something different. "Hey, Dottie," Tommy called. "Check, please. I got a roll." Dottie looked at him, her smile never fading. "You just got here, sugar. Stay a while longer. Coffee's on the house." "No, Tommy stopped mid-sentence. The man in the suit was now sitting in the booth directly across from him. Tommy hadn't seen him move, but there he was, closer than before, his pale hands folded neatly on the table. Tommy stood up, heart pounding. "I'm leaving." The man's smile widened. "You can't leave, friend. Didn't you see the sign? This is the last stop." Tommy's blood ran cold. He turned and rushed toward the door, but Dottie stepped in front of him, blocking the way. Her face was still smiling, but her eyes were dark, lifeless. "Sit down, Tommy," she said softly. "You'll feel better soon." Tommy froze. How did she know his name? I'm leaving," he stammered. He pushed past her and grabbed the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. He tugged harder, panic rising in his chest. "Let me out," he shouted. Dottie and the man in the suit both laughed softly, the sound echoing unnaturally through the diner. The jukebox played louder now, the warped melody grinding in Tommy's ears. He turned and sprinted toward the back of the diner, looking for another way out. There was a door near the kitchen. He shoved it open and found himself standing outside. But something was wrong. The parking lot was gone. Tommy stood in a vast empty field. The ground was black, like ash, stretching forever in every direction. The sky was a dark red, with no stars, no moon, just emptiness. His truck was nowhere to be seen. "Where am I?" Tommy whispered, his breath visible in the freezing air. "You're home now, Tommy," a voice said behind him. He turned and saw Dottie and the man in the suit standing a few feet away. They were no longer smiling. Their faces were empty, blank, like mannequins. "This isn't real," Tommy said. "This can't be real." "Oh, it's real, friend," the man in the suit replied. "You stopped here, and now you're ours." Tommy stumbled backward, falling to his knees. He dug his hands into the black ground, trying to wake himself up. "It's a dream. It's just a dream." "No, sugar," Dottie said softly. "It's the last stop." The man and Dottie moved closer, their shapes twisting as they walked. Their skin rippled and cracked, like they were wearing masks that no longer fit. Their bodies stretched into unnatural shapes, their shadows swallowing the ground. Tommy screamed. The next morning, truckers passing along Highway 63 reported seeing a strange sight. A big rig sat abandoned in an empty field, the engine cold, the trailer door wide open. Inside the cab, Tommy's coffee cup sat untouched, steam still rising from the surface. A sign stood by the side of the road, faded and cracked. "Last stop motel and diner 2 miles ahead." Some truckers claim they've stopped at the last stop, though no one's ever found it on a map. Those who do find it never come back. To this day, truckers tell Tommy Granger's story to new drivers, warning them, don't stop for places you've never seen before. Keep driving, because sometimes the road takes you somewhere you can't come back from. And if you ever see a neon sign glowing in the distance, just keep driving. It might be your last stop. Years passed, and the story of Tommy Granger and the last stop became more than just trucker folklore. It traveled far beyond highway stops and late-night coffee shops where truckers swapped stories. People wrote blogs about it, paranormal podcasts dug into the case, and ghost hunters showed up on Nebraska's Highway 63, hoping to find that diner or Tommy himself. But no one ever did. That is, until someone else saw it. Jody Rivers was a rookie trucker, only 24 years old and barely 6 months into her career. A firecracker with her blonde braid tucked under a ball cap and her boots worn to the soles, she prided herself on being fearless. Late night runs? No big deal. Lone stretches of desert? No problem. Her route that particular October night had her driving across Nebraska on Highway 63, not far from where the tale of Tommy Granger had taken place. Jody wasn't superstitious. Ghost stories? Ha! To her, the so-called Tommy mystery was just a spooky tale, retold by bored drivers trying to scare each other. Jody had other things to worry about, missing her deadline. Her dispatcher had messed up her timing, which meant Jody would be driving straight through the night. The clock read 1:47 a.m., her headlights slicing through the dark, lonely fields. There were no houses, no lights, not even passing cars, just empty flatlands as far as she could see. When her stomach rumbled, Jody cursed softly and glanced at her fuel gauge. Quarter tank left. Her route didn't show any truck stops nearby, so Jody grumbled and checked her GPS again. Then, almost as if someone answered her frustration, something appeared out of nowhere. A sign flashed to life on the roadside. Last stop motel and diner. Best coffee around. 2 miles ahead. Jody blinked, her brows furrowing. Where'd that come from? She slowed her rig slightly and grabbed her phone to check again. No motel, no diner. GPS showed absolutely nothing along this stretch. She bit her lip. Huh. Must be a tiny place that doesn't show on the maps. It didn't matter. A bite to eat and some coffee sounded too good to pass up. 2 miles later, her headlights lit up a parking lot. Just like the old story, the diner sat under a flickering neon sign. Last stop motel, vacancies, diner open hours. It looked run down but oddly well kept, like a time capsule from the past. A chill ran down Jody's spine, though she didn't know why. For the first time all night, she wished another car or truck had been behind her. She parked her rig at the far end of the lot, grabbed her wallet and climbed out. The air was eerily still, cold, unnaturally silent. Inside, the diner was just like the story. Spotless, with chrome tables, booths lined in red leather, and a jukebox humming in the corner. Old songs played softly, the kind of music Jody's grandparents listened to when they were young. A cheerful woman stood behind the counter. "Evening, sugar," the waitress said. Her pale blue dress looked starched and clean, a crisp white apron tied around her waist. The tag pinned to her chest read Dottie. Jody froze, her hand clenched tightly around her wallet. "It's just a coincidence," she thought. "Take a seat, sweetheart. Coffee's fresh." Jody swallowed hard and smiled nervously. "Thanks." She chose a seat at the counter but made sure she faced the door. Her pulse ticked higher. She noticed there were no customers, no cars outside, except for an ancient-looking rusted pickup, just like Tommy's story. "Coffee?" Dottie's bright voice made her jump slightly. Sure. Black." The mug landed in front of her, steaming. Jody stared at it. She wasn't thirsty anymore. As Dottie walked back to clean the counter, Jody pulled out her phone. She needed to text her brother, just in case something felt wrong. Maybe she'd laugh about it later, but something deep inside told her, don't stay long. But when she looked at her screen, she felt her heart drop. No signal, no Wi-Fi. Jody's hands started to tremble as her gut twisted. Her phone always worked, even in remote stretches of road. She put it back in her pocket, heart thudding in her ears. The front door chimed suddenly. Jody turned her head so fast her neck hurt. A man stepped inside. He wore a filthy brown suit, wrinkled and stained. His face was pale, hollow-cheeked, with gray sunken eyes. His yellow smile nearly made her gasp aloud. He walked to the counter but didn't sit. Instead, he looked directly at her, his head tilting in an unnatural way, like a broken doll. "Evening, ma'am," he said softly, his voice cold and empty. Jody's blood ran cold. She looked back at Dottie, the cheerful waitress who had suddenly gone quiet. Her face was blank now, expressionless, as if her smile had been wiped away. "Enjoy your coffee, sweetheart," Dottie said, but her voice no longer sounded human. Jody bolted from her seat, knocking the stool to the floor. The strange man turned his head to follow her movement, his lifeless gaze piercing through her. "Where you going, ma'am?" he asked, as though it were some sort of joke. Jody ignored him. She ran to the front door and yanked it open. She stepped outside and stopped dead in her tracks. The parking lot was gone. She stood in a vast black field of ash. A blood-red sky loomed above, heavy and suffocating. Her rig was gone, wiped clean from existence, as though she had never brought it here. "Welcome to the last stop," Dottie's voice whispered behind her. Jody turned around. The diner and the man in the brown suit were gone. In their place stood something else, something tall, shadowy, and wrong, its form shifting like black smoke in the dark air. It reached long arms toward her, hands curling like claws. Jody turned and ran, her boots slapping against the black ground as a terrible voice whispered all around her, repeating over and over, "This is your last stop. This is your last stop." Her screams echoed into nothingness. Days later, a trucker found an abandoned rig on the shoulder of Highway 63. The engine was cold. The cab was empty. In the passenger seat sat a coffee mug, still steaming, a dark liquid pooling at the bottom. The legend grew. Truckers whispered Jody Rivers' name, adding her to the story of Tommy Granger. Paranormal hunters flocked to Nebraska, hoping for clues about the last stop motel and diner. But none of them ever found it. Newer drivers were warned just the same. Don't stop for a diner you've never seen before. If you see a flashing neon sign in the distance, keep driving, because the last stop is waiting for someone. And one day, it might just call for you. I've always been a long-haul trucker, the kind who sees more blacktop than daylight. It's a lonely job sometimes, but it's honest work. Nothing much spooks me anymore. At least, that's what I thought until one night on a back road in Montana. I was hauling a heavy load of lumber, taking a shortcut off the interstate. The road was narrow, winding through endless pine trees. It was well past midnight, and the moonlight barely touched the pavement. The air felt heavy. I had the radio on to keep myself awake, some old country music humming softly in the cab. Suddenly, the station fizzled out, replaced by static. I fiddled with the dial, but nothing came through. That's when I heard it. A voice, faint at first, coming through the static. "Help me." I froze. It was clear as day, a woman's voice, weak and trembling. "Is this a prank?" I muttered, turning the volume down. But the voice stayed, whispering those two words over and over, "Help me." A chill ran through me, but I told myself it was just a trick of the radio. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Up ahead, something flashed in my headlights. A man was standing in the middle of the road, waving his arms. I hit the brakes hard. The truck screeched to a stop just a few feet away from him. I opened the window. "What's going on, buddy? You need help?" He looked frantic, pointing toward the woods. "She's out there. My wife. She's lost in the trees. Please, you gotta help me." Now, I'd heard enough horror stories to know this wasn't a good idea, but the guy looked desperate, and what if he was telling the truth? I grabbed my flashlight, locked the truck, and followed him into the woods. The trees were tall and thick, blocking most of the moonlight. The snow crunched under my boots as we walked deeper and deeper. "She went this way," the man said, his voice shaking. After what felt like forever, he stopped. I swung the flashlight beam around, but there was no one there, just shadows and snow. "Where is she?" I asked, my voice cracking a little. He didn't answer. When I turned to look at him, my blood went cold. He was gone. Not a single footprint in the snow where he had been standing. Just nothing. I spun around, heart pounding, the flashlight jerking across the trees. That's when I saw her. A woman in a torn dress, standing a few yards away, her head tilted down. Her long, dark hair covered her face. "Ma'am?" I called out, taking a cautious step forward. She looked up. Her eyes glowed pale white, and her mouth twisted into an inhuman scream. I bolted. I didn't care where I was running, just as long as I was moving away from her. The trees seemed endless, but finally, I burst out onto the road and saw my truck. I scrambled into the cab, locked the doors, and floored it. The radio crackled back to life, blaring static before the woman's voice came through again, louder this time. "Help me. Help MME. Help MME." We yanked the radio wires loose and threw the thing on the floor. For hours I kept driving, not daring to look in my mirrors. When I stopped the next morning at a diner, I asked a local if he'd heard about anything strange on that road. He nodded grimly. "You're lucky to be alive. Years ago, a couple crashed out there. Husband survived, wife didn't. They say her spirit still wanders the woods. And the husband? What about him?" I asked, my hands shaking around my coffee cup. "He never stopped looking for her. Some say he lures people into the woods to take his place. I haven't taken a shortcut since, and if you ever find yourself on a dark back road with a stranger flagging you down, just keep driving. Some calls for help aren't meant to be answered. I've been a trucker for 15 years. I've seen my share of strange things on the road, but nothing like what happened last winter on Route 66. It was a cold December night. Snow was starting to fall, and the highway was empty, just me in the darkness. My haul was light, and I was ahead of schedule, so I wasn't in a rush. I turned up the heat in the cab, sipped some coffee, and kept driving. Around mile marker 204, I saw a figure standing on the side of the road, waving. A woman, wrapped in a thin white dress, no coat, no bag, just standing there in the snowstorm. Something felt wrong. No sane person would be out in weather like this, not dressed like that. But I'm not the kind of man to just drive by without helping. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Ma'am, you okay? Need a ride?" I asked. She looked at me, and I swear her eyes didn't seem right. Too dark, too empty. Still, she nodded and climbed into the passenger seat. Her dress was bone dry, even though it was snowing outside. She didn't say a word as I started driving, just stared ahead with those strange, empty eyes. I tried making small talk. "Where you headed?" Silence. "Been out here long?" Nothing. The hairs on my neck stood up. Something wasn't right, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe she was just in shock, I thought. People react differently in bad situations. About 10 miles later, she finally spoke, but her voice sounded far away. "You shouldn't have stopped." My hands gripped the wheel tighter. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She didn't answer. Instead, she smiled. But it wasn't a normal smile. It stretched too wide, showing teeth that didn't look human. I slammed on the brakes. The truck screeched to a halt, and when I looked over, she was gone. Just gone. No door opening, no footsteps in the snow, just nothing. Heart pounding, I got out of the truck and looked around. Snow was falling harder now, but there were no tracks, no sign that anyone had been there. I checked the cab, under the seats, even the sleeper compartment. She wasn't there. Shaking, I got back into the truck and floored it. I drove straight through to my drop-off point, didn't stop for gas, didn't stop for coffee, didn't even look in the rearview mirror. When I finally arrived, I told the folks at the depot what happened. An old-timer there went pale. He said, "You saw her, the ghost of Route 66. They say she appears to good-hearted drivers like you, folks who stop to help. Most don't survive the ride." I haven't driven Route 66 since that night, and if you ever find yourself out there, driving alone in the dark, and you see a woman waving in the snow, don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop.